We are delighted to have as our guest speaker today the Bishop of Kensington, Graham Tomlin. Graham was my tutor at Bible College, and I was always pleased that he challenged me to look more deeply and not to take the obvious as the first and right answer. Since becoming bishop, Graham has gone on to challenge things and has frequently appeared in media, most notably to do with the Grenfell Tower disaster. Graham is also the founder of the St Mellitus College, the training college associated with Holy Trinity Brompton Church in London, and changing the whole shape of training for those approaching Anglican ministry and in other churches as well. So once again, welcome to Graham Tomlin, our speaker today.
We've recently passed some fairly grim milestones on the journey of this pandemic that we've been on over this last year. We've hit 100,000 deaths here in the UK. 2 million people around the world have now died of COVID. And that, of course, breaks down to individual people. In my own family, we've lost 3 beloved elderly relatives over this past year. And you will know people yourselves who have died or come close to death during this time. One of the things that this virus has done is it's brought us all face to face with our own vulnerability and our frailty. And yet, while we've reflected perhaps a great deal upon deaths, the statistics of death, the numbers of people who have died, we haven't maybe thought that much about death itself or about the process of dying. We get briefings from Number 10 from politicians and from medical officers upon the statistics of death and the coronavirus, but we don't get much help from them on how to die and how to die well. To be honest, we probably haven't had that many sermons on it because it's a difficult topic to talk about. But if ever there was a time to talk about death, surely it's now. This is a time when we are walking through the valley of the shadow of death, as Psalm 23 puts it. I know clergy who've had to give the last rites to people over the phone, to people who are dying in hospital or at home. NHS staff have been brilliant at trying to comfort and support the dying, but even that is difficult too. I was reading something that one doctor wrote from a hospital saying this, that once a patient is deemed to be dying, they're allowed one family member to see them for 15 minutes. The patient won't be able to see their loved one's face since they'll be wearing full PPE. All the patients who die do so alone. There's nobody to hold their hand, nobody to comfort them, nobody to tell them that they love them. We're living in a period where death is all around us, and we're not used to it. We're used to thinking of death as something that just happens when we're old. We can relegate it to that period of life. In previous ages, of course, it was much more common. People died of different ages all the way through time. In the 16th century, for example, 40% of the population didn't survive their teenage years. And in cities like London, where I live, the life expectancy for the poor could be as low as 25. Now we're more aware of death than ever as we hear and see the statistics, but also the people dying around us. Whenever we ordain priests in the church, we always read out the job description, if you like. It's what we call the ordinal for priests. There's a line in it which always strikes me. It says that one of the tasks of the priest is to prepare the dying for their death. Again, that's not something we expect to see there, to prepare the dying for their death. In the Book of Common Prayer, the old prayer book, there's a prayer there that asks that we might be spared from all oppression, conspiracy and rebellion, from violence, battle and murder, and from dying suddenly and unprepared. Now that first bit, asking to be spared from conspiracy, rebellion, violence and so on, we kind of expect that. But that second bit, dying suddenly and unprepared, that's a bit of a surprise to us because, of course, let's be honest, most of us hope that when death comes, it'll be sudden and unexpected. We won't know too much about it. But yet the Christian faith says it's really important to prepare for death. We get stories like the one Jesus told about the rich fool who piled up wealth for himself and invested in his barn, saying, I'll have lots of time to enjoy these things. You're not knowing that death was just around the corner. And the point he's making, and the point that many Christians over the years have made when they think about death, is that if you wait to think about death until you're dying, it's too late. The time to think about death is when you're healthy and well. Now, in fact, Christians in the past, and preachers and bishops and others, used to very often preach sermons on preparing to die. And I've been reading one or two of these sermons recently. They tend to be fairly pragmatic, fairly matter of fact. So they say things like simple bits of advice, make sure your finances are in order so there aren't any squabbles amongst your family and friends after you've gone. They will say things like, well, if there are people you're estranged from, people that you've got a broken relationship with, well, why not put it right now? Reach out, make a phone call, say sorry, because when you're in the COVID ward, it'll be too late to do that. But then they often say, think about life. I was reading something written by the playwright Dorothy Sayers a little while ago. She was writing about a different kind of lockdown during the Second World War, where people were huddled in air raid shelters waiting for the bomb to fall. She wrote this: cut off from mental distractions and cowering in a cellar with a gas mask under threat of imminent death comes the stronger fear and sits down beside us. What, he demands, rather disagreeably, do you make of all this? Is there anything you value more than life? It's a really important question to ask. Is there anything you value more than life? What really matters to you? The rich fool in Jesus' story invested in his barns, his finance, his wealth and his comfort. But in the last days of his life, when he lay dying, those weren't of any great comfort to him at all. In fact, when we come towards the end of our lives, it tends to be things like relationships and family and the goodness that we do have or haven't done. Those are the things that really matter to us. There's that old joke that says that no one on their deathbed says, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. In fact, actually, when death comes, if it's to come soon, to have in our minds those things that really matter to us will enable us to focus upon them and hold on to them as we come to the end of our lives. But even still, if that's not the case, if it is that death is a long way into the horizon, it'll enable us to refocus up our lives on what really matters. I had a friend a number of years ago who very sadly died of cancer. He was a very successful man. He had achieved a great deal in his time. But as he was coming towards the end of his life, I remember having a conversation with him, and he said, the question I keep on coming back to is not how much I've achieved, how much money I've earned, but it's this: have I been kind to people throughout my life? That's the kind of question you ask when the chips are down and when death is on the horizon. And so these sermons encourage us to reflect upon our life, what really matters to us, and refocus our life on those things, whether death is near or far away. But also they say, think about death, because it's going to come one day, whether now or long into the future. Now, it's hard for us to think about death and what comes after. But maybe our closest analogy is birth. I read one of these sermons by Martin Luther, and he wrote this. He said, just as an infant is born with peril and pain from the small abode of its mother's womb into this immense heaven and earth, that is, into this world, so man departs this life through the narrow gate of death. Now, his point is that, if you like, in our mother's wombs, we had no idea what would face us when we emerged into the light. In fact, we didn't even know it would be light. We didn't know what it would be. It must have felt at the time to an unborn baby like a perilous journey, a leap from the warm comfort of the womb into the darkness, into the unknown. An unborn baby can't imagine running or trees or sky or friendship or anything like that. We know that at the other side of birth there's this amazing world that we can enjoy and live in, but we don't know that within the womb. The advantage we have with death is the chance to think about it in advance, knowing it's coming our way. In one of Marilyn Robinson's novels called Gilead, there's an elderly pastor who reflects upon his life. And he says this at one point: this morning I've been trying to think about heaven, but without much success. I don't know why I should expect to have any idea of heaven. After all, I could never have imagined this world if I hadn't spent almost 8 decades wandering around in it. Now, of course, when we think about what lies beyond this life, we Christians do have a clue, because someone has walked this way before us. And we cannot think about the prospect of death without thinking of Jesus Christ, the one who died and was raised. And again, these sermons, and particularly this one from Martin Luther, says, when you come to the point of death, don't think about your sins, don't think about your mistakes, don't think about your failures, just dwell upon Jesus Christ. And that's for two reasons. One is that despite the prospect of dying unaccompanied in a COVID ward, as that doctor described earlier on, Christians know that when we come to death, we are not abandoned. Luther's sermon puts it like this: no Christian should doubt that he is not alone. He can be certain that a great many eyes are upon him, first the eyes of God and of Christ himself, then also the eyes of the dear angels, of the saints and all Christians. It's why in the past many Christians received Holy Communion before they died. Here was something tangible, something to hold on to, a pledge that they did not face this journey on their own. Very often facing uncertainty or even facing our own mortality, we ask for a sign that somehow we're not abandoned. And that's exactly what we are given in bread and wine, the promise, the tangible promise that we will not face that journey alone. But it's not just that Jesus walks with us on that journey because he's been through it before, but also he is the one waiting for us at the other side. This Jesus, who has broken the power of death, waits to meet us on the other side of that doorway. As our scriptures tell us, that we rely not upon ourselves, but upon the God who raises the dead. If, as we pray and hope, we survive this pandemic, death will come knocking on our door one day. And maybe the lesson of this time is to be prepared, to look at this life in the light of death, and strangely find that it can mean more when we realize that it won't last forever. And the death is for the Christian the gateway to something infinitely greater.